Yeah, and we're talking about long-term change in life. I think this brings us to our last figure to talk about, um, and perhaps one of the most fascinating. I think to think about really. This is Staughton Lynd, right? Who was born in 1929 and then passed away in November 2022, but had this extensive career, and a very interesting career, um, as a thinker and as an activist and as an organizer. But something that goes back all the way into the early 1950s and or late 1950s, early 1960s. Just some brief background here. Staughton Lynn trained as a historian, got his degree, his PhD, and one of his first academic positions was at Spelman College, historically black college, with Howard Zinn in the early 1960s, and got a lot, he says, out of his exposure and thinking with Howard,
Hmm.
um, and got involved in the civil rights struggle, was involved with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He also got involved with opposition to Vietnam and led a fact-finding mission to Vietnam that included Tom Hayden from Students for Democratic Society. But the interesting thing here, he does this big, really well-known book in 1968 called "The Origins of American Radicalism," which was,
Right.
I think, his academic attempt to try to grapple with all of the activism that he saw going on, to sort of say that these uprisings in the 1960s had long kinds of connections to this usable past of activism and radicalism in the United States. But that book, oddly enough, destroys his academic career
Oh, the
because
irony.
because Yale University, where he had gone at that point, decided that this was not something that they wanted to give tenure to, and so they sort of politely let him go, and he had to figure out what to do. And then this shifted a big career change for him in away from sort of academic history into law.
Into labor law.
Yeah, labor law. So he and his wife Alice moved to, I believe it's Youngstown, Ohio, around that time, and things start to shift for him in a lot of ways as a result of working with Alice and then going to law school.
Yeah, that their partnership, Alice and Staunton, lasted. He died at the age of 92, almost 93. Lasted until his death. They were married in 1951. They were partners in many, many ways in political activism and organizing. He was actually inspired by her political activism early on. Um, they they did a number of projects together. They edited a number of books together, oral histories. There's one called Rank and File, which is oral histories of working class organizers. But there's others since then. They did a documentary history of nonviolence in the United States, and they were both. I mean, they're kind of an exemplary model of being in partnership with somebody for a long, long time together and sharing those kinds of values.
And I think that, I think too, from what I understand at least of the experience of going to Youngstown, was that Alice was already working to sort of think about how to contribute to organization and labor struggles, because she was collecting oral histories at that time of workers and other activists and things when Stoughton got booted out of Yale. Um, and from what I understand is that part of his working with Alice to help her do her work inspired him to think about going to law school.
Yeah.
Right. And so, what he decided at this time, and this is a lot of this stuff comes out in a book that I have used before in some of the classes that we've taught together, from 2013, called "Accompanying Pathways to Social Change." The account that he gives there is that, um, after he got kicked out of Yale, he was trying to figure out what to do with himself, and he decided to become a lawyer. in order to be able to be a resource for working class struggles in law. And so he went to become a labor lawyer. He realized that the best thing he could do, I think he, as the way that he explains it there, is he saw the kind of work that Alice was doing with conscientious objectors, the kind of work that she was doing with labor folk and racial justice folks, and realized that the best that he could do was not to try to position himself as some kind of leader in these struggles,
Right.
but as to become a resource to help struggles already underway by providing them support, particularly legal support, in order that those kinds of grassroots leaders can continue to function. So, in accompanying, right, he says he became a lawyer in order to be able to help and provide services, legal services for working class folk, union leaders, and workers. And so a lot of the work after after 1976 was just creating support, solidarity support for uh, worker struggles in Ohio. And I think part of that was not only the labor work, but I think he also talks about how they created reading groups,
Yeah,
mixed reading groups, right, with workers and
that
academics.
lasted years and years.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That were these kinds of places that were um, not these kinds of snooty intellectual spaces, but places where people from different backgrounds could really come together to think about issues with one another, and that the kind of spaces that they created then allowed them to be able to do other kinds of solidarity actions with one another. So their
right.
reading groups would be able to sort of sit together and talk about things, and then if there was a picket somewhere, their reading group could all
Sure.
get together and go do a picket together, right? So they were not just like reading groups, but they were sort of these activist groups that were also trying to work intellectually with one another to help understand the nature of struggle at the time.
And it was at a time when in Youngstown, Ohio, the steel mills were being closed, and there was massive layoffs, and people were wondering, how do we fight this, right? So in your reading group, you're not only reading critiques of, say, capitalism or work relationships or the alienation of labor, but you're applying what you're reading to what's going on in your life and in your town, and how it can help you form opposition and resistance. And he also did not encourage people to rely on leaders, but to think of themselves as leaders. In fact, he and Alice, one of their books together is called We Are All Leaders, which is about labor organizing in the early 1930s. And that whole wobbly idea, the IWW idea that we can all do what it takes to make a movement together. And we can learn, we all have these capacities and we can all learn these kinds of skills. And even as a lawyer, he put out that little booklet, short little booklet called Labor Law for the Rank and Filer. So he says, you don't have to come to me as a lawyer. I'm just going to put what I know about labor law into this little book. So you can make your choices. You can read it together with other people in your workplace and then decide how to move from there toward forming a union or toward addressing problems.
Yeah, and I think that really sort of went into the work that I think the book first came out in 1992, but Solidarity Unionism,
Solidarity unionism.
where he sort of put all of these thoughts together. I think the second edition of that came out in 2015, but the idea that that he advocated that workers should think about um, you know struggling together and thinking about themselves in a workplace as an important collective, without having to rely on formal labor unions to do the work that they do, to be able to struggle against their employer for concessions, or thinking that labor law is somehow going to protect them, but that there's important kind of work that can be done, workers themselves developing a sense of their importance in the workplace and the crucial side of integral work that they do in the workplace, that they can get a lot done by forcing struggle in the workplace without having to rely on formal unions, labor leaders, or the structures of labor law. That's a powerful idea, and Ryan goes back to the sort of wobbly ideals that you were
Yeah.
talking about, which were so influential in so much of his thinking about labor struggle. in the 20th century.
Right, and he and Alice's book on the early 1930s, The Forms of Industrial Organizing. We are all leaders, right? So shop floor action was really important. Coming together in solidarity was really important. And he understood as a lawyer the way that the law constrains and bounds what unions can do formally. So that if you're going to act for each other, that sometimes that means acting in ways that don't rely on those formal structures.
I also want to sort of note the way in which it seemed that sort of a kind of awareness of Latin American struggles was important for his thinking.
Yes,
And of course, there's the book Wobblies and Zapatistas that came out, where there was an opportunity to think about wobbly ideals with the developments of the Zapatista struggle in Mexico and the
right.
important overlaps and points of contrast from that, which was a really sort of vibrant book, I thought, um, um, that a lot of people might not know about any longer, since even though the Zapatista struggle is now with almost 30
30
years, that
years.
the anniversary will be next year, 2024. And such an important kind of struggle for thinking about global justice and oppositional consciousness to globalization in the 1990s. And Staughton really believed in the importance of thinking about how these new ideas could connect to that usable past of the Wobblies in the United States. But so that there's that one connection. But the big one, of course, is the book I already mentioned, Accompanying, uh,
Mm.
where he advocates as a model of community organizing, not the kind of model that comes out of labor organizing, or at least a certain kind of model of labor organizing, maybe the Alinsky style organizing, whereas you have an organizer that from the outside that pops into a community for a little while, sparks indignation and opposition, gets people to learn about their power, and then develops a few leaders, and then steps out and lets them do their work. Um, Stoughton thought that this was really not a very good model. Uh, uh, and instead suggests this idea of accompanying, which he said he gets from Latin American struggles, particularly the kind of work of Archbishop Romero
Yeah,
in
yeah,
El Salvador, which was not about like sort of parachuting into a struggle and then leaving to go to the next struggle, but trying to develop long-term roots in a community in the way that he and Alice did with Youngstown, Ohio, of being in a place for decades and trying to figure out how to be a resource, not a voice, but a resource for a community. And he suggests that, so-called professionals, that PMC, if you want to help struggles, maybe the way to learn, he thinks, is as a teacher, as a lawyer, is to think about how you can accompany struggles that are already taking place. So instead of thinking of yourself as an organizer that goes in and catalyzes a struggle of people, or organizes unorganized people, all those kinds of things that Alinsky sort of talked about, is to realize that people are sometimes already struggling. People are already working in various kinds of ways. If you have the education and the skills, your job is not to sort of go there and get out in front, but perhaps to ask these folks, what can I help you do?
how can I accompany you? How can I accompany you in the struggle?
Right, and it's sort of
Right.
that again, that
Not lead
Zapatista
you.
ideal. Yeah, how do I walk along with you?
Right. How do I walk along with you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
that's powerful.
so, and what's interesting is, like I said, this seems to be something that they come to from their awareness of Latin American struggles, which I think is, again, that tie with Mike Davis, right? The sort of ways in which thinking about multicultural, multiracial models of collective action and organizing were important for them in thinking about what it means to build a left in the United
Right.
States.
He and Alice also wrote a book called Liberation Theology for Quakers, because they were Quakers. That's where their dedication to nonviolence came out of. But they were also both deeply familiar with the liberation theology coming out of South America, Mexico. Um, and I think that was an early influence for them. And then you see it coming all together. I agree with you about this in the book accompanying, you know. So his advice to young radicals is, at some point, pick a place and pick a community and just dig in for a long, long, long time and accompany those struggles and figure out how to be a resource for those struggles. Of course, when you're doing that, you're also being supported in different ways by the people that you're working with. So
Hmm.
it's not just you giving, right? You're also always receiving. You're walking alongside with. You have that companionship. You have that sense of solidarity that is always developing and
Yeah.
needs to be attentive to local conditions. So place is very important.
I think that this model, I know that, we, as I mentioned before, you and I have used this model in classes that we've taught before, and I've taught it in other classes too. I always find that students have a hard time grappling with this suggestion that Staughton has about accompanying. Um, and I've seen this too. I mean, you and I both have seen many different kinds of generations of labor organizers come through our classes, and we've continued being friends with many people. And still, the model is work a few years here and then move on, and then move on from there and there and there. But I've seen that this model is really hard for a lot of young people to grapple with, the idea of picking a place and sitting there for a long time. This really goes against the kind of American ethos now of mobility and kind of um, sort of creative energy of wanting to be mobile in certain kinds of ways.
Right.
I wonder whether, I don't know if Staughton ever sort of addressed that, but I think this is a real big challenge to get young people to sort of take the accompaniment model seriously.
Well, if you're talking about people in their 20s, I'm thinking of Stoughton and Alice as being their own example of accompaniment. And they didn't actually move to Youngstown until probably into their mid 30s or sometime like that. I mean, it wasn't like you got to do it right now, right? It's like as your life develops and you are part of different struggles, at some point, be sensitive to the fact that you might be in a place that is becoming home for you and putting down roots there and working with the community that you identify with, right? So um, I think that it's actually written for people who are a little bit older. That this idea of accompaniment makes more sense if you're a little bit older. At least that part of it, where you're choosing a place and choosing to stay there a long time. The general idea of instead of being a leader in the struggle, that you're accompanying people in the struggle, that's more generalizable, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's really sort of caught on in the past, say, 20 years or so. Of course, Occupy um, had that model of a leaderless movement, and it's something that I think has been carried on to a lot of like the Black Lives Matter movement as well. There's a lot of talk about like not creating figureheads and leaders that can either be co-opted or taken away,
Right.
but trying to figure out like how do you. I think there's a new book that came out not very long ago. I'm going to totally flub up on it. Maybe I'll leave it in the notes for folks to look at. But there's a new biography of Ella Baker that
Oh,
came out recently that I've been trying to get a hold of. But the concept there, that this historian says that Ella Baker represented, is catalytic leadership, right? And so instead of being, like I said, instead of positioning yourself as a voice, say like uh, Martin Luther King, the
right.
voice of movement, you are instead a kind of figure that helps to activate various kinds of leaders in the grassroots. And Ella Baker did this to some extent. And, Alinsky labor organizing is about catalyzing as well, but it's very much about sort of kind of temporary connections to a community.
Right.
Staughton Lynd, I think, represents this kind of Staughton and Alice represent this attempt to try to be catalytic leaders in a way. Uh, some sort of, I don't, it's even hard to think about whether they saw themselves as leaders, but as catalysts of a certain sort, of being able to help uh, different kinds of sparks that were already sort of taking place in a community.
Right.
So I think that that sort of model of leadership that he's talking about here, I think, is starting to become uh, much more recognized as an important part of social justice struggles in the United States. And maybe this idea, maybe the added element here is the notion of rootedness in place.
Yeah, and I think much like we've talked about these other figures, that part of Staughton Lynd's contribution is to this ongoing project of understanding or developing what we mean by leaders in leadership, instead of just assuming, it's the big personality that looks good on TV,
Mm-hmm.
that gives voice, as you say, right? Well, what is leadership? And what are all the kinds of things that the people that we think of as good leaders do? And can that be distributed amongst a number of people? Are these capacities everybody has the potential to develop? Maybe you're stronger in some fields than others, but leadership is not just to get us to think about those questions. What do we mean by leadership? What does leadership do for a movement?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what are its weaknesses? What are its strengths? How do we understand it? Is it something that can be shared? Because Ella Baker was all about shared leadership.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's we could have another conversation about that in itself too, and perhaps we maybe we should do that. But I think wrapping this up, I think that this has highlighted a lot of things that these figures that we've been talking about, Mike Davis, Barbara Ehrenreich, Dave Foreman, Staughton Lynd, are really these kinds of vibrant figures in the past 40 years or so to contributing to a really sort of vibrant conversation about oppositional leftism in the United States. But some themes that seem to see popping out is the question about how to think about the past, not as a static entity existing uh, in time, but as narratives, stories, inspiration for our present struggles, but also ways of helping us to envision what a future might be like, what we might hope for, ways
Freedom
of
dreams.
yeah,
Yeah.
freedom dreams, and analyzing the ways in which our real freedom dreams get sidelined by these kinds of slick stories of pleasure, of consumption, that can short circuit real attempts to develop uh, genuine ways of being together and developing collective joy, ways of developing new tactics. And I mean, I think part of what Dave Foreman did, in some sense, was look back at the labor struggles and the ways of that people thought about monkey wrenching from the struggles of the 1930s, and think about how to bring that into the environmental struggles. So for him, that became a usable past to really change the nature of the environmental conversation in the United States in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So I think a lot of this stuff has been that we've discussed is the ways in which a lot of these figures were really important in ways in helping us to think about what does it mean to use the past to develop our thinking about the future.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's probably a lot more to be said, and I think we can continue having some of these conversations on things. But I want to thank you for your time, Tony, to
Thank you
help
for the invitation.
to think about some of these figures that we lost in 2022, and how they contributed to leftist thinking in the United States. But I want to thank everyone who's kept with us. I hope that some of this stuff has chimed in, or that you've learned perhaps some new figures to go and look at. A good place, of course, to begin with all these figures actually is, you can go and Wikipedia all these folks. Their sites have been updated, I think, with a lot of information, but a lot of good bibliographies with some of these. I hope that some of the mentions of the key books have inspired you perhaps to think about picking some of these up. City of Quartz, Ecology of Fear, Nickel and Dimed, Bright Sided, accompanying, solidarity unionism, the origins of of American radicalism, all good places to sort of pick up and look at things. So thank you for spending your time with us. If you have any sort of questions or comments, please go ahead and leave them with us, or you can contact us at the Anarres Project at anarresproject.org. You can also find us on various social media, but we'd love to hear from you and to hear if you've had any sort of thoughts about any of these figures that we've talked about today. So thank you once again, Tony.
Thank you, Joseph.